So this week, good afternoon. This week and next week, we're going to discuss two emblematic figures, Huey Long today and his significance to the concept of American democracy, and on Henry Ford 2 weeks from today after spring break. Again, both fascinating, quirky, unique figures within this larger concept of American democracy. Huey Long, I'll go into more detail, but I'll start with a film clip. Huey Long, that gives you a sense of Huey Long. It's actually a live presentation, so here it is.
Quite an honor for Mr. Harry Link to come around to my apartment here in the New Yorker Hotel this morning. And Harry, what I want you to do is to see my composition, Every Man a King. Fine. I want you to play it over for these people. And if you like it, I want you to put it out. Good. That's right. Why weep or slumber, America, land of brave and true, with castles and clothing and food for all belongs to you. And a king, every man a king, or you can be a millionaire. But there's something belonging to others. There's enough for all people to share. When it's sunny June and December too, or in the winter time or spring, there'll be peace without end, every neighbor a friend, with every man a king. Every man a king, every man a king, for you can be a millionaire. That's fine. But there's something belonging to others. There's enough for all people to share. When it's sunny June and December too, or in the winter time or spring, there'll be peace without end, every neighbor a friend, with every man a king. What do you think about that? I think it's fine. I think it's fine. Senator, I think it's fine. Okay.
So that gives you sorry about that. Gives you a bit of a sense of Huey Long's personality or lack thereof. He was a major populist figure in the 19th century. He was born in 1893, died in his early 40s in 1935, one of the most significant and powerful and celebrated as well as despised figures, and especially politicians, was seen as a populist champion of the poor, but also was denounced as a kind of fascist demagogue. And Henry Ford, the same way. They're radically different attitudes towards each of them. Huey Long was both loved and hated. In fact, in many respects, I mean, you read some chapters of Huey Long. Huey Long reminds me a lot of Trump. And in many ways, he's unlike Trump in that Trump is much more explicit about his renunciation of the idea of democracy, as reflected in what he did after losing the election. Whereas Huey Long did not go that far. Huey Long was primarily, I mean, he was a national figure, but his base was the South. To this day, Louisianans still most Louisianans see Huey Long as a great hero. But both, like Long and Trump, well, the other difference is that Huey Long came from dirt poor farmers, whereas Trump was born in the mansion, as it were. Huey Long, though, like Trump, often ignored the Constitution, often ignored the democratic process. Robert Penn Warren, a fellow Southerner, saw Long as a dark prophet. And in fact, if any of you have read Penn Warren's best novel, All the King's Men, it was based on Huey Long. Willie Stark is the central character, and Willie Stark is this charismatic, very influential leader, and Warren drew it from Huey Long. Long was born dirt poor in Louisiana. He got his start working as a traveling salesman while also studying for the law, including he studied a bit at Tulane. But in those days in Louisiana, you could study with a lawyer. You didn't have to go to a law school. He passed the bar in 1915. He ran for governor of Louisiana in 1924. Lost. He was elected governor in 1928 amid scandal. Scandal is a term that became synonymous with Huey Long, and then elected U.S. Senator in 1932 in the midst of the Depression. Huey Long was very clear at defining, and this is also similar to Trump, I would say. He defined people either as a friend or an enemy, and there's no middle ground. You're a friend or you're an enemy, and there's no ambiguity, there's no middle ground. He tried to destroy the latter, and he was very successful at destroying a lot of political enemies. He rammed bills through his mostly obedient legislature in Louisiana, and one of his opponents walked up to him, thrust a large volume into his face, and said, "Maybe you've heard of this book. It's the Constitution of it's the Constitution of the state of Louisiana." How did Long respond? He said, this is accurate. He says, "I am the Constitution now." So again, similar to, in my view, Trump. You're free to debate that. As governor, Huey wanted a new governor's mansion. And this was a period where Southerners were still very self-conscious of their loss in the Civil War, and before the Civil War, Southerners prided themselves on being superior to the North. They accused Northerners of exploiting workers. They imagined the Northerners being exploited in these massive mills and worked almost to death. Essentially, they were pretending that the artisanal North was, in essence, industrial England or France, which was simply untrue. He wanted, and so in the South, in Louisiana, that was still seen as a backward state in the early 20th century, and he wanted to revitalize the state, and he created a new governor's mansion. Without asking for the legislators' approval, which was required, in not just Louisiana, in virtually every state, he received a loan of $150,000 from the State Board of Liquidation, the agency authorized to borrow money, that he then phoned the warden of the Angelo State Penitentiary and told him to send a gang of convicts to Baton Rouge. Most of these convicts were African Americans. And when they arrived, Huey led them to the existing governor's mansion and cheered them on as they demolished the old building before they created a new one. Huey Long, how many of you have been to Baton Rouge? So have you seen the Capitol? It's an extraordinary capitol. It's an Art Deco state capitol. In my view, it's the most beautiful capitol. Huey he built it in 1932 after winning his bid as U.S. Senator and did not hold back money for this new capitol to essentially represent himself, but also suggest to the nation that Louisiana was a central and important state, and certainly the most aesthetic state in his view. Once while ramming bills through his obedient legislature, and Long, if an enemy was elected to the legislature, Long found a way to tarnish him and to have the legislator fired. While ramming through bills in his legislature, one of Long's opponents walked up to him, thrust a large volume into his face, and said, "Maybe you've heard of this book. It's the Constitution of the state of Louisiana." And Long said, "Yeah, as I mentioned, I'm the Constitution now." He actually said that on numerous occasions. He sought almost dictatorial control, and a number of scholars have characterized Huey Long as a dictator. There's a lot of legitimacy of a kind of dictatorial control that he wielded.
What did he propose?
What he proposed.
Programmatic.
His main program, his programmatic vision was to modernize the state of Louisiana, to modernize the nation so that people could travel from one place to another without the huge barriers that had existed, especially in the South, but throughout the country. He was a major advocate for creating an infrastructure in the United States that would allow people to achieve the American dream. And for Huey Long, in much of the South, the American dream was less industrial, and in a sense, the artisanal work that we talked about in the antebellum period, after the Civil War, it was much more common for artisanal work to be in the South in the wake of the war, at a time in which the North was radically industrialized, which we talked about.
And he derided the two parties.
And he completely derided.
Their supposed difference.
Yes, yes.
Tweedledee and Tweedledum.
Yes, Tweedledee, Tweedledum. He saw the two parties as essentially useless. And in essence, he was open about his kind of monarchical sense of self, and of his image of democracy really was one that was small part democracy in terms of voting, big part a benevolent king or benevolent figure who would transform the nation into a place where everyone could be every man a king, every woman a queen. And again, in that sense, similar to Trump, in my view. Trump, he is a major appeal of Trump for a lot of comparatively working class or poor Americans is Trump doesn't use the term that every man and woman can be a king and queen, that the opportunity to achieve the American dream of economic security especially, and to a degree cultural security, political security.
And how did he conceive the redistribution of wealth?
So I will get to that in a second. Huey he actually advocated redistribution of wealth.
By what means?
By the state, and each state would set aside money, and there would be a tax, a large tax on families owning, or families with income. And Huey Long also tried to analyze or obtain figures for net worth, and for the very wealthy, they would have a very high tax rate. So that's how he was able to share the wealth in many respects. Although he was ultimately.
By redistribution of income, not redistribution of assets.
That's correct, redistribution of income. Yes, there were a couple individual cases where he sought to redistribute assets, but that was much harder to do, and it was usually not successful. Usually not successful.
And for example, his approach to the differentials of education, of public education.
He was a huge champion of public education, and in fact, in this instance, he was very successful before he became a politician. Before he was known, LSU was. It was one of the weakest schools in the country. And during Huey Long's reign of power, especially in Louisiana, but in the nation to a degree, LSU became and was seen as an Ivy League institution. And in fact, there were a number of Southerners in the early 20th century who received offers from Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and they chose to go to LSU because they felt it was a better place. And Long gave enough money so that the heads of LSU would try to recruit the best scholars in every field they could. It really was a first-rate institution for a few decades. Yeah, it was, and so he recognized, having been born dirt poor and essentially self-taught until studying for the law degree, he recognized the importance of education as a site and source of democracy, and that's where you could, in a sense, celebrate him.
And what was the main complaint against the two major parties? That they were complicit in the perpetuation of this division between rich and poor? Yes,
that they were complicit. And in fact, Huey Long, it changed with FDR. Huey Long hated FDR. He hated FDR because he felt that
FDR was tolerant to Huey Long.
Yes, he was, because he recognized Huey Long's power. And he thought that by trying to befriend Long, he could help some of his goals. He could achieve some of his goals. He recognized very much the power and the significance of Long. Yeah, that's a great question. Long expanded inadequate public health facilities. He improved conditions for the mental ill. He founded a major medical school. As I mentioned, he transformed LSU from a provincial school to a major, highly respected university. He started night schools. He supplied free school books, state-supported school buses, new classroom facilities for poor children. He very much believed in the infrastructure of a good education. He increased taxes of the rich. He dramatically increases taxes on corporations, especially utilities, which he had a bête noire with. And he helped create a modern infrastructure with basic services and facilities on which economic progress depended, especially in Louisiana, but in other. He advocated that for other states as well. Before Huey Long came to power, there were no paved roads in the entire state of Louisiana. So if you were whatever kind of of company or business or work you did, just being able to move from one place to another in Louisiana was extremely difficult. Huey Long literally created roads in the state. And he advocated for a national road system, but didn't have the power to implement that. He was also the first Southern demagogue, and really the first Southern politician, to leave aside race baiting and to address the plight of the poor, both black and white. In this sense, he was unlike every other Southern political figure. His rise to power did not depend on stoking the flames of racism and lynching, which was all too common during this period. So in that sense, he really advocated a kind of democracy. Yeah, he's transracial. But his transracial sensibility also coincided with his understanding that there's this huge chasm between rich and poor, and he sought to explode that rigid hierarchy between the very wealthy.
By creating a coalition between poor whites and poor blacks.
Yes, by creating a coalition between poor whites and poor blacks, and by taxing the wealthy, taxing the rich, and providing protection for the poor. Yeah, and encouraging and helping creating an infrastructure helped people start businesses in which they would hire other people or have a family business or a farm in which you could actually send products to market. So yeah, that was part of his success. He took his seat in the Senate in 1932, supported FDR in the 1932 presidential election. At the Democratic Convention, Long gave a rousing speech for FDR. Clarence Darrow, the criminal lawyer, told Huey that his speech was one of the greatest summaries of fact and evidence he had ever heard. Huey Long was widely considered one of, if not the greatest orators in the United States at this time. And this was still an era, unlike our own era, in which not as profound as the antebellum period, but I mentioned that in the antebellum period, being an effective public orator or public speaker was one of the most admired and prestigious positions one could have. And in a sense, the great public speakers were analogous to the great athletes of today. That's how popular they were. If you were a effective public speaker, you became almost a celebrated public speaker. You were a national household name, and Huey Long was very much part of that.
Was his discourse overtly religious or not?
It was not overtly religious. It was subtly religious, but not overtly. And in this sense, he was also very different from the mainstream South, in which sermons and a lot of, Billy Graham was a Southerner who ended up going north and establishing his ministry in Minneapolis because he didn't want to be pegged as just another Southern preacher. And he wanted to be not just a national but international preacher. Huey Long was similar in that sense, in terms of the oratory. That's also a great question. Let's see. Yeah, Will Rogers also recognized Huey's talent as an orator. Essentially, so he was part of this, the Americans who were household names famous. FDR kept Long at arm's length, though. He worried that if the Depression was not soon curtailed, American people, much like those in Germany and Italy, would lose patience with the democratic process and turn to radical leaders like Huey. And that's another parallel, in my view, with Trump. FDR said of Huey, "It's all very well for us to laugh over Huey Long."
Parallel to Trump, I don't understand.
Because, in my view,
Because Trump isn't proposing any radical change in the American system.
he's,
In the way he has an unorthodox, a personalist and unorthodox approach to the exercise of power. But he's not proposing, for example, massive redistribution.
no, he's not, but he did, despite the very clear loss in 2020, pretended, insisted.
Usurp power.
Yes, the usurp power. And usurping power in a democracy profoundly threatens a democracy. Trump has, in my view, identifies himself more closely with Putin and Xi than he does with someone like FDR, in terms of his quest for power and the whole concept of the democratic process. I mean, both Long and, well, especially Trump, he has never acknowledged that he was
So this
beaten.
seems like a good place to introduce one of the two themes
Yes.
I wanted to discuss in relation to Long. One of the themes is the relation of Long to the Madisonian Constitution and Madisonian constitutionalism. So on the surface,
right.
it could seem Long is the antithesis
Yes.
of Madisonian constitutionalism.
Yes. Yes.
On the assumption, characteristic of conservative political science and conservative statecraft, that politics is either cold and institutional or hot and anti-institutional or extra-institutional.
Yes.
So it's either
Yes.
Madison or Mussolini,
Yes.
right? And
Yes.
long-standing for Mussolini. And now, one of the ways in which one might begin to question the absoluteness of this opposition is, you could say, in fact, the Madisonian constitutionalism does not offer a reliable safeguard
That's right.
against
That's
this
right.
demagogic populism,
That's right.
because it is easily overwhelmed
Right.
if there is agitation from below or
Yes,
from above.
That's exactly
So
right.
if there is a populist leader who takes it over, one of two things will happen.
Yes.
If the populist leader has subordinated the judiciary, and
Right.
especially the
Right.
Supreme Court,
Right.
and the Congress,
Right. Which Trump
to
has
his
tried
will,
to do.
to his will,
Yes.
then the populist leader becomes a quasi-dictator.
Yes. Yes.
With a very weak and inadequate restraints imposed by the other branches of
That's
government.
right. That's right.
And the background to this is that in the design of the American Constitution, the President of the United States occupies the position of the King of England,
Yes.
and was
yes.
designed as a substitute for the King.
Yes. Yes.
So, now, if on the other hand, the President has lost control
Right.
of the judiciary and of the legislature, he then becomes an agitator against them
Yes. Yes.
and seeks popular support down
Yes.
below
Yes.
for this agitation.
Yes.
So those are the two ways in which the supposed political logic of the Constitution can be flipped,
Yes.
turned on its head.
Yes.
And
yes.
that's what has happened from time to time in American history.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And Huey Long is as you point out, is a wonderful emblem of that example. And I would say Trump is as well, but in very different ways.
With the difference that Long had a vision of
He did.
the transformation of the country.
That he did.
in
That's
the
the
interest of
difference.
The masses.
Yes, yes. And he genuinely devoted a lot of work to help the poor, to help and being poor in the South at that time was a lot worse than being poor in the nation of any kind, the nation today. It was, I mean, they were.
I think that one of the utilities of this way of thinking is it raises the question of what's the relation of this populism,
Right.
this political populism,
Right.
to the transformation of the constitutional order. Because you could see it as simply the opposite
Yes.
in these ways,
Right.
unless it becomes a source of its perversion
Right.
in one of the ways I just described.
Right.
But you could also say that this Caesarism, this personalist Caesarism, is the liquid form of a future political design.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes. That's
So
very good.
There's some subtlety, some ambivalence,
Very.
right?
That's right.
It's not just a form of perversion or corruption.
Yes.
It could also be the incipient form, the inchoate form of another constitutional order.
Yes. Yes. That's right. And that other constitutional order could be a Republican order. Could be a Republican order. I mean, yeah, that's fair.
So this is very interesting because we were commenting before class on the visceral hatred of the American liberals
Yes.
for the figure of Long.
Yes. Yes.
So it's not just that Long appears to them as a Mussolini, it's that Long is the negation of their worldview
That's right.
and
that's
their
right.
view of what politics can and should be.
That's right. That's right. And in that sense that they ignore the populist successes that Long had. I mean, in a sense, Long was a kind of Caesar figure before Caesar became autocrat. Caesar as a Republican, where he still had power, but not.
Well, I think in all these forms, there's an autocratic tendency because
yes,
the populist leader says,
yes,
I refuse to have my hands tied.
right.
So if the purpose of the Madisonian constitutionalism is to tie the hands of the leader,
Right.
the leader says, I'll untie them with the help of the people.
Yes.
And the question is whether he sincerely does
Yes.
or whether he does that just as a pretense for the usurpation of power.
Yeah, that's a great question. So
the
yes,
usurpation of power, typically in the service of the dominant interest in the country, right?
Yes, yeah. And that's so in that sense, Huey Long, it's one of the ways in which he differs from Trump, in my view, from that Madisonian understanding, and that he genuinely did seek schools that could be open for everyone.
So the social premise of this transformative populism
Yes.
in the United States is a different approach to the question of the relation between race and class.
That's right. That's right.
Which is, as it were, the road not taken in American history.
That's right. That's right.
Because what ended up prevailing in the United States was this idea that we discussed before of racial oppression
Yes.
as a threshold issue,
Yes.
which has to be separated from class, dealt with separately and prior
Yes.
to any confrontation
Yes.
with the sources of economic inequality.
Yes. That's right.
What's suggested by Long's career and agitation is that race and class have to be connected from the beginning.
Yes. Yes.
And
Yes.
the result of their connection has to be a coalition
Yes.
between the poor whites and the poor blacks.
That's exactly right. Which he sought to, he advocated for, but he also recognized that there was, I mean, he was also very concerned about his status, about his power, and he felt or recognized that collaboration between blacks and whites would destroy his political career in the South.
I think it's very important to consider this idea of the relation between race and class
Yes.
in relation to the typology
Yes.
of ways of approaching race and class in American history.
Yes, yes.
And what are the main orientations? So I would say first there's an accommodationist or
Yes,
collaborationist
yes,
orientation.
yes.
This is Booker T. Washington.
Yes.
Which is not collaboration or coalition in long sense,
Right.
but rather the sense that in the Booker T. Washington sense, that the blacks accept a subordinate position and don't defy, and the subordinate position is the petty bourgeois position.
Yes, yes.
Which is our theme from the
Yes.
beginning of the course.
That's exactly right.
Because the initial idea in the United States was that everyone would be a petty bourgeois.
Yes, that's right.
And now when that is overthrown or abandoned,
Yes.
then it's no longer the general objective,
Right.
because the free whites will become wage workers,
Yes, yes.
subordinate wage workers.
Right.
But the ambition of the blacks is to become petty bourgeois.
Yes, yes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and there were numerous examples during this time. There was, I can't remember her name, but there was an African-American woman who had the largest, who was the most successful entrepreneur and business man or woman in making and selling and disseminating hair products.
But that's an exception. That's
Yes,
someone who
yes.
emerges.
That's emerges, but
That's
it's still possible as an example of how.
Now,
it's not-
it seems to me that the paradox of that, what's paradoxical about that first position is this. Actually, to achieve that
Right.
as a national result requires a great deal of militancy
Yes,
and
yes,
agitation,
yes,
because
yes.
that result cannot be obtained simply by smiling faces
Right,
and
right.
obedience and accommodation.
Right.
So, and if you had that militancy that could achieve the petty bourgeois position
Yes.
for all the blacks, why would you stop there?
Yes, yes.
So that seems to me what's incoherent
Yes.
about that first orientation.
Yes, that's exactly
Then
right.
a second orientation is the secessionist view. So
Yes.
the blacks literally leave the United States and go, for example, to Liberia.
Right.
And I have the impression that the main manifestation of the secessionist view in American history is that the secession is like a feint or a pretense because it's not carried out. They
Yes.
don't actually leave the United States.
Yes.
What they do instead, as in the case of Farrakhan,
Yes.
is they go into an internal exile in the United States.
Yes, that's
They
right.
isolate
That's exactly
themselves
right.
from the rest of the society. And now comes the surprise.
Yes.
What's the content?
Yes.
Or what's the manifestation of
Yes.
this internal exile? It's that same petty bourgeois
That's right.
respectability and
Yes.
so forth.
Yes.
So Booker T. Washington and
Yes.
Farrakhan,
Yes.
who on the surface rhetorically seem to be the opposite,
Yes.
in practice are very similar.
That's exactly right. And it goes back to the antebellum period. We didn't discuss it, but the antebellum period in the 1850s, on the eve of the Civil War, Frederick Douglass is the best example, and that was Douglass planned after Lincoln's first inaugural address, in which Lincoln is primarily trying to protect the border states from seceding. Maryland was ready to secede. He actually prevented a Maryland secession vote. And had Maryland seceded, D.C. would have been surrounded by rebels, and it would have been disastrous. And so Lincoln that's an example. And but Douglass at that moment said that based on Lincoln's inaugural address, he offers no indication for ending slavery, even though he's anti-slavery. He plans a trip to Haiti, and he says if Haiti, and he publishes it in his newspaper, it's widely circulated. He said if Haiti's the rich and almost utopian republic that I've read about, I'm moving there permanently. And the reason he didn't is that Southerners bombed Fort Sumter, and that's what started the war, and he recognized the opportunity of the war to destroy it. And that was true with a lot of black leaders in the 19th century in the same way that you mentioned in the early 20th century.
So in this so then comes the third orientation to the race issue, which was this integrationist orthodoxy.
Yes, yes.
Civil rights orthodoxy.
Yes.
So race is prior to class and treated as separate.
Right.
So first you have to deal with race,
Right.
then you deal with class.
Right.
And that way of thinking about race and class became, it seems to me, the template or the paradigm for the later identity politics,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Because then this way of thinking of the racial issue becomes the basis for thinking about groups generally.
That's right. That's right.
And the negation of a class
Right.
politics.
That's right. That's exactly right.
And this is what was accepted in the United States
Yes.
and became the predominant attitude to the race issue.
Yes. Yes.
And then we have the discussion we had about affirmative action as the
Yes.
example.
Yes.
So let's recall the failures of affirmative action. So first, it separates the black elite
Yes.
from the black
Right.
rank and file,
Right.
right? And creates this black professional and business class,
Yes.
which is co-opted by the elite establishment.
Yes.
Second,
Although in the early 20th century, as I mentioned, there were some very successful, wealthy African Americans who had national, international businesses and were able to avoid that co-optation. Yeah.
so second, it generates advantages that are in inverse proportion to the need for them.
Yes.
So whom does it benefit most? It benefits most this black professional business class.
Right.
It benefits less the black working class, especially the black working class in public employment,
Yes.
like
Yes.
policemen and firemen and so
Yes.
forth.
Yes.
And whom does it benefit least? The masses of poor young blacks,
Yes.
especially young black males,
Yes.
who are in the secondary part of the labor market,
Yes.
the unstable part of the labor market, and in the American prisons.
Yes. Yes.
They're the predominant element in the prison
Yes,
population,
very much so.
and the victims of this system.
That's right.
So
That's
I
right.
don't know how this could be accepted in the United States by the American liberals as a good result and celebrated by the historians, by the intellectuals,
I agree.
by
I
people like
completely
Gilles
agree.
Lepore as the whole objective of American history,
Yes. Yes.
when in fact it's a social disaster.
Yes. Yeah. No, I agree.
So then the fourth orientation would be the one that tries to connect race and class,
Right.
was briefly exemplified in the United States in the period of Reconstruction, right? By
Yes,
the
yes,
activities of
yes.
Freedmen's Bureau,
Yes.
4 acres and a mule,
Yes.
and so
Yes.
forth, 40 acres and a
40
mule.
acres and a mule.
And in the beginning of the 20th century, now by long,
Right. Right. That's
who-
exactly
who,
right.
who illustrated it in Louisiana
Yes.
against the current
That's right.
on a much broader scale than the 40 acres and a mule
Yes.
of the Reconstruction period.
Yes. Very much so.
So we could say that from substantively, long exemplifies the road not taken.
Yes, that's
this.
exactly right. That's exactly right. Which is why a lot of scholars and people who have written on Huey Long, actually some of the biographies are recognized Long's contribution but most scholars today see him as a lunatic and as a almost totalitarian figure.
And the journalists, the sub-intellectuals and
Yes.
so forth.
Yeah.
Because their attitude in politics, their characteristic attitude is they're close enough to the political agents to see all their defects.
Yes.
Their
yes,
human
yes.
but because their attitude is contemplative,
Right.
it's also ironic.
Yeah.
And irony leads to fatalism, as Goethe said.
Yes, that's true. That is true.
And so their characteristic attitude is that in politics there are the insiders and the outsiders.
Yes.
The insiders are opportunists,
Yes.
and the outsiders are crazy.
Yeah.
And so between the insiders and the outsiders, you have to prefer the insiders.
Yes.
That's what the
Yes.
sub-intellectuals
Yes.
think, the journalists,
Yes.
because you have to have you have to prefer the opportunists to the crazy people.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Huh?
Yes.
And that's all connected to this hostility that they have to law.
That's right. That's right. To this day,
Yes.
there's, as I said, there's three. I mean, one of the biographies you read is a fairly sympathetic biography. Yes. Go ahead.
Multi-generation Louisianian, and I'm really glad we're talking about Huey Long.
So, Cher, correct my mistakes.
No,
but-
I am by no means an expert. You've done a lot more work on this than I have, but I'm just fascinated. And just for, from the perspective of someone growing up in Louisiana, I mean, we're fascinated by Huey Long. Also,
Yeah, I am too. I think he's such a fascination is
Yeah.
the exact
Well,
word.
tell us
Yeah.
Yes.
what is the attitude to him today in Louisiana?
yes. Well, first of all, there's an iconic Huey Long Bridge in New
Yes,
Orleans.
yes.
Everybody knows his name, even if you don't know
Yes.
who he is, you know the bridge. Anyway,
Yeah.
so he's always symbolic of infrastructure now.
And the State House, isn't it gorgeous?
It's gorgeous.
It is gorgeous.
And the
it's-
governor's mansion is gorgeous too.
The governor, yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, as like a young kid growing up in Louisiana, and obviously growing up in a very red state that obviously is still by any means backwards, Long did present this road not taken.
Yes.
So as like a young kind of idealist growing up in Louisiana, it was, oh my gosh, Long's a hero. I mean, he did all of this stuff that, he fought for these things that, were, he fought for equality in a lot of ways. I mean, he really tried to boost Louisiana up and a lot of Louisianians. And I wanted to comment too on this whole Long versus the elites and the legacy of that, because it's true, Long is hated,
Yes.
particularly by New Orleans elites.
Yes,
the
that's
rest
right.
of
That's right.
there's
They hated him.
they hated him.
Hated by the elites, right?
Yes, by the
Elites who are
right.
congregated in New Orleans.
right.
It kind of started, it didn't start this, but there is a huge divide between the moneyed in New Orleans versus the rest of the state of Louisiana.
Yes, yes.
And Long was the epitome of, really up until this time, it was the moneyed elite, was the plantation owners,
Yes,
right? And it came
yes.
from that. They were the ones who owned property in New Orleans.
Yes.
The rest of the state, obviously, dating from those times, the rest of the state versus New Orleans, which it's complicated now, but there is still this legacy of the elite hate Long. The rest of
Yes.
the state loved him.
Right.
So I
Obvi-
think
yeah.
something that is a resource of the United States in its transformation are these regional differences, right?
Yes.
And when they diminish, the country loses one of the instruments that would have to reinvent itself.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly right.
Regional differences were much more accentuated.
I mean, as I mentioned, as you know, Huey created a network of roads. And he does that in a way to help the poor. And the planners hated that. They hated that.
Right. And as you mentioned a couple classes ago, the reason Louisiana didn't have infrastructure was because of the plantations.
That's
It was so
exactly
that
right.
people
That's
couldn't
exactly
escape.
right. In
Yeah.
the same way that in the antebellum period, they hated an infrastructure
So-
because they still wanted to be their own kind of their own nation almost.
So just to have an image of the reality of these regional differences, I mentioned to John this episode that Michael Lind told me about,
Yeah.
which is that Calvin Coolidge who was president right before Herbert Hoover, dealt with a violent Boston police strike, a police strike here in Boston. And Calvin Coolidge, as President of the United States from Vermont, issued a proclamation addressed to the delegation of Harvard College, to the delegation of Texas in Harvard College, the Texans who were students in Harvard College, asking them to help put down, suppress with weapons the Boston police strike. And because the assumption was that the Texans would all be armed, the Texans in Harvard College.
Yes.
And this was, in 1920 something, not that long ago. Huh?
Keep going.
And on the, yeah, sorry, cut me off. I get really excited about this stuff. On the regional differences, and especially on going back to the Louisiana Constitution versus the United States
Yes.
Constitution, for example, just want to point out, first of all, it hit a lot of Louisianians hard. Who are Democrats, there's very few of us. But it hit us hard when people started comparing Trump to Huey Long, because we're like, no, because of course there's similarities. Of course they both abused power. Of course Huey Long is, in a lot of ways, a really crazy, bad individual. But there is this idea that in his abuse of power, he was dealing with really bad source material. The Louisiana Constitution, for those who don't know, basically has been very rarely updated since the Napoleonic Code of 1804. It's civil law. The rest of this country is common law. There are some really ridiculous laws. I believe, if I'm quoting this right, there's a law that says you can't tie an alligator to a fire hydrant. And that still exists.
Yes, I actually read that. I've read that.
Yeah.
That's very good. That's very good.
Yeah, I keep a list of
And
them.
it's actually similar to during the Civil War when Union troops just took over plantations in the South and retained that land, and there was major controversy over that in the post-war period. Yeah. Yes.
Well, I just want to say I'm so inspired by your energy. It's so cool to see that and the excitement for it. I just wanted to offer forward a modern example or an example from today. I saw a lot of qualities in Long that also exist in the former governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo. I worked for him and also worked, unfortunately, laterally to him, and his use of power was so absolutely outrageous.
Yes.
However, it was excused because, just like Long, he built roads and bridges
That's right.
and airports and
That's-
everything that everybody wants, and
That's right.
he's completely out of his mind and will literally I've seen him destroy people in ways you cannot even imagine. And
What was said in favor of Mussolini? What was said was that he made the trains run on time.
Right.
in Italy.
That's
No, that is-
exactly
and-
right. That's exactly right.
Truly, this man is out of his mind. But people love him, and he's a villain.
Yes.
In every single way, and it's
Yes.
such a lesson of if you make it's like Johnson with the lights were turned on in the prairie.
Right.
People were like, "That's great. I don't care what he's like."
Yes.
He gave us electricity.
Yes.
It's such a lesson in that.
Yes.
And I feel like Cuomo he is similar to Trump too.
Yes.
But he's the left version of today
Yes.
of Long, and Trump is the right version of today.
That's a wonderful characterization.
Yeah.
So that relates to another question, which we might at some point discuss, which is now that there's an emergence of this populist Caesarism in the world, in many places in the world, but almost always on the right rather than on the left.
Yes. Yes.
As with Long.
Yes.
So why on the right rather than on the left? And I think that one reason is that the leftists in the world in the late 20th century were all humanizers. They weren't proponents of a new scheme of production, a new form of human energy, right? So they were the sugarcoaters.
Yes.
So they come onto the stage of contemporary history as the humanizers of the inevitable. So you ask them, what's your program? And they have to say, our program is the humanization of the program of our conservative adversaries. We take their program, which is the savage market order, and we we recreated it in a more humane form through compensatory redistribution by progressive taxation
Yes.
or redistributive social entitlements. And that's an inauspicious terrain for the flourishing of this populist agitation.
That's exactly right, which perfectly maps onto Long in that sense. I mean, he advocated redistribution.
I just want to add one tiny thing to that. There's something that is very prevalent, or not prevalent, excuse me, very obvious today in these kinds of characters, and I think why, and I'm not sure why it's more prevalent on the right than the left in this way, but there is a willingness to use power on the right that the left doesn't necessarily exercise. There's a flinch on the left, which is why Cuomo is unique, because he doesn't have the flinch.
Yes.
On the right,
Yes.
everyone, they're not the good guys, so they don't have to flinch. They can just do whatever they want. I put this in quotes. Good, they don't care about that. It's not their number one priority.
Right.
On the left, they're obsessed with being good,
Yes.
which is insane
Yes.
because it's politics. So it's like, it's a very challenging thing. And I think the flinch is, there's something to it. I don't know what the like scholarly term would be for that, but it's so recognizable today too.
Yes, it is. That's a great point too. That's a great point. These are wonderful, wonderful points and contributions. Yes.
I have a question about, we're talking a lot about Long is like leading this political change. He has these ideas, but wasn't Brinkley arguing that, regarding the Share the Wealth movement, Long was kind of popping out of communities, sharing a few ideas, and then most of the legwork was being done by those local communities,
Yes,
right?
yes.
And so maybe Long is a figurehead or kind of this, a face of a movement, but he's maybe not in charge or like leading this populist movement. This desire already existed in the communities,
Yes.
and Long just gave a face to it. So I was wondering if we could maybe put a new channel in the conversation instead of talking about Long, talking about this desire that already existed in the communities and what the legwork that the communities were doing, rather than Long being the one that's making the.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Long recognized what the communities were doing and essentially passed legislation to empower them. And you're absolutely right that he did not do the work himself. I mean, which is true with, even at that time, it was true with most national and state leaders, as they delegated the actual work to other people, but supported this transition and this the change and the transformation in the community or state, if that makes sense. Yeah. Yes. Go ahead again. Then you.
And I'll stop, I promise. I really like the Cuomo-Long comparison. That's actually,
Yeah.
I like that a lot. So like
Yeah,
a couple
that's a
things.
great quote.
But first, to address the other point, I mean, that's a good point about, communities. I mean, the desire, obviously, in Louisiana, from what I understand, was there. But communities were really lost. I mean, not only did he create infrastructure, which connected the communities, which was
Yes,
huge,
yes.
but he really, I mean, he was a militant supporter of these people, and they hadn't had someone fighting
Yeah,
for them in
that's
that
right,
way.
yeah.
And he was huge on economic development, which he embezzled. I know it was terrible.
Right.
And I know that we don't, obviously the petroleum industry has a very different context today. And I work in environmental stuff. But Long brought, in a lot of ways, he used oil as a way to promote economic development in Louisiana for not just the oil corporations, but for the people who were working there. And I know that's like a big kind of glossing over a lot of stuff. But that was another thing he did, is that he made that possible from a
Yes.
legislative standpoint.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's-
But on the Long and Cuomo thing, I think this whole idea of them being of Democrats being obsessed with being good, that is such a huge thing.
Yeah, that's great.
Huge.
So this is another expression of this South American, Latin American caudillismo, right? The caudillo.
Yes.
Perón, Vargas, Cardenas,
Yes.
because they all have this, they
That's
were all developmentalists.
That's right.
National developmentalists. So the cause of national developmentalism, which at the beginning of the history of the Republic
Yes.
had been embodied by Hamilton,
Yes.
was retaken later on with this populist tinge by Long.
Yes.
So
Yes.
Long was the counterpart to the national developmentalists,
Yes.
and combined this developmentalism, the infrastructure financed by oil, with the creation of an alternative social basis
Yes.
for his project.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's right, that's great. Yes. Can you turn your mic on?
Just a couple comments on this idea that the difference between the left and the right is that the left flinches at sort of disturbing the legal order. I think that it's important to distinguish between what the appearance is and what's actually happening, because one of the reasons why, from the perspective of the right, one of the reasons why the left will flinch is because the left relies on the saliency of the current legal order to provide for its constituency. The welfare state, the programmatic element of the federal government is an enormous part of the base of the left. So, and that's not necessarily the case for the right. So I think officials, you know, in political positions are very hesitant on the left to challenge the bureaucracy in many ways because from a political standpoint, it would be harmful. But I think also,
But
just
hasn't the left recently in American history been inhibited in affirming the primacy of the class character of this space? Because the class character is qualified or broken up by this identity politics business and this predominant attitude toward race and class.
Right.
can you say more about that?
So, just in response to the part of your comment in which the left is building this constituency, it's building it and not building it because it's building a potential constituency, but then in some way denying it or denying its primacy by accepting the primacy of group identity politics and this division between race and class. And you can't do that and expect to be triumphant.
I mean, when it comes to like class, I'm not sure I'm following, because at least with respect to a comparison to the right, in the traditional small government versus big government sense, the left is on the side of the labor unions, the left is on the side of Medicare, the left is on the side
Unions
of,
have disappeared.
Yeah.
well, now they have.
So their real economic basis doesn't exist. So in a world in which the vanguard of the economy was for this mass production, those are the Rust Belt industries.
I agree with that. So then this would be my point, I think. The reason why the left is sort of disoriented in America right now, looking for a new message, looking for a new platform, is because traditionally, while I agree with you, they don't necessarily rely on this bureaucracy anymore, they traditionally have. The right, its program since the rise of Trump has been to attack this bureaucracy, to say that this bureaucracy is corrupt. The left has built it for its own political ends. It's not serving the American people. It's hurting American interests, and we need to tear it down. That's I think the
But
view
with
of
no
the.
productivist project, right? It has a distributivist project, but it doesn't have a productivist project. So you take someone, you take the leaders of the left in the Democratic Party, like Bernie Sanders.
Yes.
He came to this course 2 years ago when I taught with Cornell West.
Right.
And the impression I had hearing him and in the discussion with him was that he thought that the best thing that could possibly happen with the United States was that it would become more like the Sweden of 1970. And that's just total losing position. That's a non-starter.
Yeah. No, that's,
I
but
yeah,
I
I mean, I
remember
think
him saying that.
I think that's in
Yeah.
part because a lot, I mean, my guess would be one of the reasons why populism is so salient today is because people don't feel the desire necessarily for a productive project. They're more likely to resonate with a message that is, I have been held down for decades and I just want to be freed. And I want to be angry at the forces that have held me down, and I'm going to support the person that tells me they're
But
going to.
that's the pedagogic role of politics, to show that primordial desire for agency, the power to act, to do stuff, depends on having a developmental project. Otherwise, it has no economic basis.
Yeah.
One final thing, I'm sorry to take up so much of the talking time. I love your points that you're making because I think it's important to insert that into the conversation. So continue to do that because then I learn too as well. And I think what's really interesting about what you said is that you're right that the right has been historically like, that's terrible, smaller government, like there's corruption, there's fraud, there's abuse. And like arguably like there's parts of what they're saying that is right? Like there is waste because like this is too big and it's hard to know what the hell is going on here with all the money. That is like 100% right. But what is interesting about that is that for the members who are especially part of red states, their constituencies still do rely on things like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, which is why it's so fascinating, I think, from the outside now to see the attempt to break it apart, or even like veterans benefits, because these are people who, without this government resource, right, which a significant part of our budget goes to. I think it's like 65% of the budget is like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, which is insane. But that's like, that just shows you the need. I think what's interesting is like they're fighting for that destruction, but then like, what are they gonna offer the people that they represent? So I'm not asking you the question, it's just like, that is just such an interesting conundrum, because that's a disaster.
I mean, it's a good question. I think it actually takes us back to like social debates that we used to have in this country. Like, is one of the effects of a welfare state to discourage the search for employment? Is a system that makes it very easy to rely on benefits, does that make it harder for businesses to crop up in certain areas of the country? And I think, I do think that the project of the right in many ways today is supplemented by a trust in the market, that if you take away all the beef that goes to the government and you free up markets and you start to like rebalance trade deficits, you will promote American industry
Yes,
over
but
time.
of course, the theme that's not discussed is which market, because the premise of that conservative position is that there is a single natural and necessary way of organizing the market.
Right.
So they get the government out of it. But the trouble is that that's a superstition. That's just false.
Really last thing I'm going to say the whole class, I promise. That also doesn't account for the fact that there's a percentage of that population that receives those benefits that are older, that are disabled, that can literally not, like they will die basically. They'll be unhoused, they'll have no way to get around, they can't get around, they have no health care. Like there is a percentage that, and because we're in this like boomer aging generation, and also like it's getting more expensive to live, I think that's like, it's just like it's a recipe for like a complete explosive disaster, in my opinion. So anyway, that's it. Last thing I say, I promise.
No, that's, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, just like one, yeah. I was nodding to what you were saying, but just, yeah, like one additional comment here is I would add on your comment about kind of the left being the one floundering. I would actually argue that the right now is more divided than the left. I mean, I think the right is the one that's really splintering because, quote, Trumpism is very different from what used to be the conservative right.
Yes,
So I would
yes.
just make that point.
Yeah. No, that's, I mean,
Where would you locate the difference? What's the most important difference?
Well, I various different things. I studied economics in undergrad, and I would say that, the traditional conservative standpoint was just much more ideologically aligned. And it was more about the free market, and it was more just about these purely, financial motives, but then also just
Free
things.
market meaning a particular idea that they had of what a free market is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And really, I guess the conservative right used to be what I guess the Libertarian Party is now, whereas Trumpism really is this, I mean, it is populism, but it's populism that is really just, you know, it's not organized. It's not, it's everything is kind of fighting against each other, and we've gotten into social issues now, which like the right never used to kind of weigh in on social issues.
So what about the subject that we discussed earlier in the course, which now what used to be the vanguard of production is disintegrating.
Right.
These Rust Belt industries, Fordist mass production.
Right.
And now there's a new vanguard, the knowledge economy, but it's insular.
Yes.
And it excludes the great majority of people. So the great majority of Americans are then consigned to some kind of make work. And this tiny elite is in the vanguard. And the vanguard and the new vanguard, instead of spreading, becoming the model for everything, is doing the opposite. It's becoming narrower and narrower because the masters of the new vanguard have found a way to bifurcate the process of production. They keep the lucrative and creative part they keep for themselves. The routinized, commoditized part, they subcontract to workers in firms in remote parts of the world with lower wages and lower tax take. And that's what's happening in the country. But that would be a recipe for a new kind of populism, which attack that.
That's right. That's right.
So I don't know if there is now in the right a populist wing, say represented by someone like Bannon, does it have an actual program to deal with this?
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I just want to say I agree with much of what both of you are saying. I'm sorry I can't call you guys by your names. We don't have name cards in this class. But I think also, like, one of the ways that the right is really divided is, you know, like you saw the president bring all those CEOs up there for the inauguration. And I'm thinking, like, you guys are totally right. You know, he's saying the president wants to balance the budget. The only way the president can balance the budget is by raising taxes on the elite. He wants to extend the tax cuts.
Right.
And he's basically, I think, coming to terms with the fact that in order to do that, he's going to have to, like, say no to a lot of the rich friends that have typically benefited. You know, that part of the conservative party is going to have to take a huge hit. You know, so yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting point. There are like trade-offs that I think the right, like now the right has had this idea, but now that it's actually being put into practice, it will face the practical trade-offs. So I definitely acknowledge that.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a complicated subject, which I don't think we've discussed completely, but I don't think that the only way in which they could, quote, balance the budget is to tax the rich. It would be good to tax the rich, but I don't think it's a requirement for balancing the budget. The main reason, the main difference between the United States and the European social democracy in fiscal terms is very simple. It's that the European social democracies take in at least 10% of GDP more than the Americans. The American aggregate tax take is at least 10% lower than the European aggregate tax take. Now, how is it that the Europeans take in that extra 10%? They don't take it out by redistributive taxes. They take it out by an overtly regressive tax. The basis of the European tax system is the indirect and regressive taxation of consumption through the flat rate value-added tax or some functional equivalent to it. That's how they actually take it out. And that then produces this higher level of entitlements. And what's interesting is that in Europe, no right-wing party in any European country has succeeded in lowering this tax take, or has even tried now. Now they've abandoned, they've accepted it. So the focus of right-wing politics in Europe are other things like immigration, not the tax take. The tax take is now treated as a non-political subject, is out of politics, and there's a social contract in which it's naturalized. So I would say that if we're to think about redistribution, the three principles that are the first is what matters most for redistribution is nothing about the budget, either on the spending side or on the revenue raising side. It's about structural change, and structural change in education, in the organization of labor markets, in the access to capital. That's what matters. Now, then you come to the second principle in the descending hierarchical order. It doesn't mean that the budget cannot have redistributive effects. It does have it. But in order to understand those redistributive effects, you have to take account of both the spending side and the revenue raising side. And what matters in the short term most is not the progressive profile of taxation on the revenue raising side, but simply the aggregate level of the tax take and how it's spent. And that's the explanation of this enigma, that on paper, among the rich industrial democracies of the North Atlantic world, the American system is the most progressive, because it's the one in which progressive taxation of personal income has a central place. The European systems, on paper, are regressive because they depend on this regressive and indirect taxation of consumption. And the explanation is the way I just said, that the reliance on the flat rate value added tax allows the Europeans to maximize the tax take by relying on a tax that is completely neutral with respect to the system of relative prices. And so the idea is you maximize the tax take, but minimize the economic trauma to the incentives to save, invest, and employ. But what happens in the United States is the politicians at election time pay homage to redistributive taxation as a way of showing whose side they're on.
Right.
They know, or they should know, that the effect of progressive taxes on redistribution is entirely marginal. Because as I said, real redistribution depends on structural change. And secondarily, to the extent that the budget is involved, on the aggregate tax take and how it's spent. Now you come to the third principle, down the hierarchical ladder. Suppose you say you still want to have a redistributive tax in the system. You don't want to abandon the principle of redistributive tax. What are the two targets of a redistributive tax, the two important ones? One target is the accumulation and exercise of economic power. And the second target is the hierarchy of the standards of living. The first target is very hard to reach by taxation. The most efficient way to reach it by taxation is at the moment of death, by a radical tax on inheritance, or anticipated inheritance through gifts inter vivos in the family. The other target of redistributive taxation is the hierarchy of standards of living. And the way to reach that is by an individualized tax on consumption, in which you take the aggregate income of the individual, income to labor and income to capital, you subtract invested saving. That difference is then what the individual spends on his standard of living. And that difference you can tax violently on a steeply progressive rate if you really wanted to. So you can say below a certain level of income, the individual doesn't pay anything. On the contrary, overseas, that's what the Americans call the negative income tax. As you go up the hierarchy of standards of living, you pay more. And at the top, the sky's the limit, because you could, the highest rate is not 100%. The highest rate is anything, 500%. You could say, for every dollar you spend in luxury living, you pay 5 to the government. There's no technical difficulty in the administration of that tax. It's the same as any declaratory tax or as the income tax. It's just a question of political power and political will. So if you really wanted to have redistribution through the tax system, that's what you would do. So I think there's a huge amount of confusion and mystification in this discussion, yes.
Can you,
The vast majority of the wealth in the upper classes from which we would want to redistribute is tied up in capital and investment. So that would be part of the amount you subtract off of the consumption that the ultra wealthy are doing. So you would be getting correct me if I'm wrong, right? But you'd be getting very little from the wealthy to actually redistribute.
I think the way to hit that is to hit it, as I said, at death. Take it away from them. Confiscate it when they die or before they die and give it to survivors.
Good luck.
That's the most efficient way to do it.
so actually Huey Long advocated that. He advocated a wealth tax. It was his signature speech
Death tax?
of a wealth, of denouncing wealth inequality and a
And
wealth.
I think that that's understood in the United States. I was speaking once with a rich person, one of these billionaires who finances the right in the United States. And I asked him naively, what is the source of your success? And he told me, I'm going to tell you a story. There was an orchard close to where we lived, and with apple trees. So I started to buy apples at 5 cents an apple. I bought the apples at 5 cents and I sold them for 10 cents. And my apple business expanded dramatically. And then I hired other kids to do this, to do the picking and selling and distributing it. It's growing exponentially. Then one day my father died and I was rich.
That's exactly right, yeah. No. Huey actually recognized that problem. Yeah. It's also why he very much, became very much at odds with FDR. And in fact, he said of FDR, I can promise him and he knows it, or I can out-promise him and he knows it. People will believe me and they won't believe him in terms of advocating for a wealth tax. He's, in fact, he says of FDR, he's living on inherited income. And he developed an almost pathological hatred of FDR, saying that he believed that anyone with a physical infirmity was bad or affected in other ways. Which
Well, that's like Trump, right?
Yes, that's exactly like Trump. He hated FDR's NRA, National Recovery Act, he was assassinated in 1936. But the wealth tax was, especially then, truly radical. And no one, who's advocating that today? Is anyone?
Well, the estate tax.
The estate tax, exactly.
Remember,
That's right. The estate tax.
It wasn't very
That's right.
long ago.
That's right.
That the then two richest men in the United States, Bill Gates
Yes.
and Warren Buffett,
Yes.
led a campaign
That's exactly
in
right.
favor of the estate tax.
That's right, which is a
And they
form
took
of
out full-page advertisements
Yes.
in all the American newspapers. Maybe you weren't around to observe this, but this happened relatively recently.
Yeah.
And they failed.
No, that's right. It was a big immediate splash and it just,
Because the majority in the country didn't want it.
yeah.
Right? This is what the leftists call false consciousness.
That's right.
So,
And yes, because so many Americans ultimately define themselves in terms of wealth. And not about how much they're making on an annual basis, what their salary is, but their wealth. You know, how much am I worth? And which is, I think, wonderfully wonderfully resonant that two of the wealthiest people in the country recognize that problem and have the humility to say, you know, it's to really make a democracy, we need to deal with wealth, not with income, but with wealth.
No, and furthermore, there was always a religious basis for massive philanthropy.
Yes, yes, yeah.
Andrew Carnegie.
Yeah,
said,
yeah,
"The
Carnegie.
man who dies rich
That's
dies
right.
dishonored."
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Can we talk more about the tax piece of this, because this is an area that I don't know as well. If we do one of the two options of what's been suggested here, right? We do that wealth tax, then does that?
Let me just interrupt
Yes.
with one observation. The American system is, the linchpin is the income tax. The income tax is a blunt instrument.
Yeah.
And all over the world, rich people don't pay income tax. The income tax is basically a tax on the salaries of the so-called middle class.
Right.
That's what it is.
Right.
So if you really wanted to use the tax system for redistribution, you have to do these other things, like what the Europeans do.
Right.
And there's zero discussion of that in the United States.
That's right. That's right. In fact, I'm curious to know if anyone since Huey advocated that.
No, some economists do.
A few economists did that.
They
Yeah,
usually
maybe
don't
like.
get jobs or don't get tenure or whatever.
Yes, in the back.
Largest wealth transfer in human history, probably in the next 10 years. Like about 15 to 20% of Americans will be receiving inheritance from their parents that are probably around 10 times more than the annual, 10 times more than the annual income of their relative peers.
Yeah.
I'm curious whether or not, what you think regarding whether or not this will change the debate regarding inheritance tax. I think that's probably a much more feasible way of making that argument versus a wealth tax. But I also wanted to ask, does it challenge our assessment of capitalism and meritocracy, given that now around 20% of the income, 20 to 30% of America's wealth in the next 10 years is going to be through inheritance, not actually generated income. It's going to be passed down from generations. I'm curious if that's going to actually change.
Not labor generated.
Non-labor generated, exactly.
So, and what's the question? Whether this will change the attitude?
Do you think this will change maybe American or European political sentiment on our assessment of capitalism, number one? And number two, do you think there is a stronger case to be made on taxing inheritance or a death tax versus a wealth tax?
I think as a practical matter, the inheritance tax is much more effective than a wealth tax. Because a wealth tax to be acceptable socially in any of these contemporary societies has to be a very small tax. Whereas an estate tax can be confiscatory and has been in several societies.
Yeah.
So the inheritance tax, anticipated as also a tax on gifts in the family, intrafamilial gifts, is much more effective. But I insist on my prior point, which all of this is less important than structural change.
Right.
So take the example. So I would say that in the world, generally, the most admired system is European social democracy, or what it used to be. So if the world could vote to be a system, it wouldn't vote to be the United States, it would vote to be Sweden. But it has a completely mistaken understanding of what Sweden is. So the actual Swedish model involved many decades of conflict between the Swedish state and the familial dynasties, the dynastic plutocracy that to this day owns much of the Swedish production system. Now, and so the Swedes developed a series of legal instruments of trusts which expropriate part of the control that these familial dynasties have over the firms, but leave them with their wealth. So there was a compromise between the social democratic state and the dynastic plutocracy of Sweden. Then the welfare system, these entitlements that people like Bernie Sanders admire so much, was like it was like the epilogue after this conflict. When they don't see the narrative, they just see the epilogue. So they think they could be like Sweden by just arranging for the system of entitlements, but not going through the long conflict that preceded it, which was the real basis of the country. So it's completely different.
Yeah. It is. It's completely
And I
different.
think that in politics, that's the importance of this pedagogic element. You have to explain. You have to explain to the people the real nature of the fiscal system and its effects. And it's full of paradoxes, like this paradox of the Europeans being more progressive, although on paper they're more regressive. It has to be explained.
Right,
And
right.
no one explains it.
That's right.
So if the economists barely understand it or don't understand it, how can you expect the people to understand it? And it's a formidable obstacle.
Yeah. So how would you overcome that obstacle?
There's no alternative
Yeah.
to explaining it. So I don't think there's anything in this stuff that can't be explained and understood
I
by
agree.
anyone.
I agree.
And I'm astonished that no effort is made to explain it. So that there's this business about this genuflection to redistributive taxes,
Right.
and not explaining how they're effective or not effective, or what really happens.
Right. That's right.
And this and the basic obstacle is this primacy of market fundamentalism. So what do I mean by market fundamentalism? I mean this idea: a market order has a single natural and necessary form.
Yes.
It has property,
Yes.
and the practical economist to this day thinks that.
Yes.
A market is a market, property is property, contract is contract. The lawyers know, or should know now, that that's all false.
Right.
Right?
Right.
That's what they discovered in 150 years of dispute.
Right.
Thanks to people like Oliver Wendell Holmes,
Yes.
who showed that as you go down the ladder of abstraction from the general principles of property and contract down, at each point there are alternatives. And you can't resolve the choice of alternatives by referring back to the abstract conception of the market.
Right.
There are conflicts of vision,
Right.
conflicts of interest. You have to decide which way you'll go.
That's right.
So the purest form of market fundamentalism is the Hayekian idea. If Robinson Crusoe trades long enough on his island, he will eventually reproduce the whole system of German private law. The idea is that implicit in spontaneous coordination and exchange is a whole system.
Yes.
So that's the extreme.
Right.
So I would say what prevails now in the world is a soft version of market fundamentalism. It says there's this thing, capitalism. capitalism, the Marxist idea of capitalism is another name for the reactionary idea of market fundamentalism. It's the same idea. There's a natural form, there's a system.
Yes, the natural order, right.
And the soft version is the version that there are varieties of capitalism. There's the Anglo-Saxon variety, there's the Rhineland variety. So there are these little variations on the penumbra. But no one thinks that in fact a market order can be designed in radically different ways.
That's right.
But how can it not be designed in radically different ways? Because if you take the idea of the market even to the highest level of abstraction, it has at least two dimensions. One dimension is the absolute level of economic decentralization, the number of economic agents able to bargain on their own initiative and for their own account.
Right.
The other dimension is the absoluteness of the control that each of those agents has over the resources at his command. Yes. Is it unconditional?
Right.
Is it perpetual? Can he transmit it by inheritance? Right. And so on and so forth. So market fundamentalism believes that these two dimensions, absolute decentralization and absolute control, go together naturally and necessarily. They don't go together. They obviously don't go together. In fact, they contradict each other. Because one of the ways in which to increase the absolute level of decentralization is to relativize the absoluteness of the control. To say, no, we'll have partial rights, temporary rights, conditional rights, and that happens in the organization of financial markets. Because the contemporary financial markets are markets in derivatives of the property rights. That's the technical term, derivatives.
That's right.
Is actually a legal term.
That's right.
Based on this idea that components of the property right are factored out, and you establish a market in those components, in options, in puts, in calls, in swaps, and so forth. So it's a familiar idea, it's just not generalized or radicalized. So all of this is in the background to the confusion about the reconstruction of the market. Yes, you back there.
I just wanted to ask more about the structural reforms and maybe also with your proposal of capitalism without the capitalists in financial markets as well, how that would fit into
No, I
sort of
didn't
this
propose
dispute.
capitalism without capital in financial markets. I proposed as a speculative exercise, a thought experiment, that idea of the investment trust, the social trust, just to make the point that the idea of the market has no self-evident expression.
Right.
So I say, imagine a system in which what Karl Marx called the means of production are vested in a series of public trusts, liquid capital and technology. And these trusts, under different models of time horizon, risk, and so forth, conduct a rotating capital auction. So people bid for the temporary use of those means of production. And then whoever is able to use the resources most effectively gets to use them for a while until someone else comes along and bids them out. So I was simply saying, that's a market. But in that market, no one is an absolute owner. And the means of production don't belong to anyone. Yes.
Yeah, I did want to ask a couple lectures ago about that as well, with the temporary use. I'm not sure like how sold you are in implementing this, but couldn't that also encourage, if it's short-term, some short-term profit maximization means? Like I can imagine, say, an investor taking temporary control of some of these assets and just doing
Well, I think
what they do now.
just to clarify the sense of this thought experiment, the most important point is not to suggest that as a way of organizing a market. The most important point is to say a market should not be nailed to the cross of a single dogmatic version of itself. So we would always want to have the absolute property right of the 19th century as one of the forms of economic decentralization, because it has a great advantage, which is that it allows someone, the owner, to do at his own risk
That's right.
something that no one else believes in.
Right.
That's the advantage of the traditional property right, that he doesn't have to negotiate vetoes. He doesn't have to get a bunch of people who, stakeholders, and
That's right,
reconcile
that's
their
right.
interests. He can do something that only he believes
That's
in.
right.
And that's enormously beneficial to society.
Yeah.
But we would never want that way of organizing economic decentralization to be the only possible way. That's the criticism.
Yes.
I had a few just questions about the estate tax, but just on that, your idea that, you know, the current structure of the market isn't something that we always have to just accept and we can sort of recreate it. In your model, who decides when somebody else has a more productive use of capital? Because in the
No, of
current
course,
model,
of course, those are all contestable. So one way of thinking of this is, so first of all, observe the following. Under orthodox finance theory, that's what already happens. Theoretically, in a perfectly competitive capital market, the capital market allocates resources to the most effective users. So for example, when there was a so-called spontaneous privatization in Russia, and the oligarchs gained control of standards and acquired the resources of the Soviet state for a song, people said, it doesn't matter, because over time in the operation of the market, those resources will end up in the hands of the most efficient users. That was their theory of how the system works. So what this thought experiment does is simply to test whether it really happens, rather than just take on faith the idea that will automatically happen. Now, then who sets up these investment trusts? The democratic institutions, whatever they are, the legislature, the Congress. They set them up under different models, and then they see how it works. Instead of judging dogmatically that a good market is like this or like that, you see what the results are over time. You have some, depending on the time horizon, the tolerance for risk, the technical features. So the democratic institutions organize the auction of capital under different regimes. And
you don't think there's a
results
risk?
are then judged in the light of the outcome.
You don't think there's a risk in that system that if the democratic means and the democratic institutions are administering capital, that
No, they don't administer. It's not administrative allocation of capital. They just organize different regimes for the auctioning of capital. And these.
Yeah, but who decides at the auction?
What?
Who decides at the auction? Someone has to say this person has the best plan.
No. I think the role of the social will of the democratic institutions is to organize what the main options for the regimes will be. The actual funds would be administered by professionals. So it'd be competitive and technical, and then you see what the result is. So obviously there are a million details that you have to work out, but this isn't an institutional blueprint that I'm proposing. I'm proposing just a thought experiment to say, is this not a market? Conceived in a completely different way. So I think the relation to the United States is this enigma. The Americans are tinkerers. They're experimentalists.
Right.
But they say, we'll experiment with everything, like Thomas Edison, except our institutions.
That's right.
So there's their national philosophy, their school of national philosophy is called pragmatism. So They're the radical experimentalists, but they accord to their institutions an exemption from the reach of the experimentalist impulse. Revoke the exemption.
I would say the dividing line is that experimentation sort of implies that there isn't coercion. And in order to experiment with institutions, you have to introduce coercion. You have to force people to do things that are against their will. And I think the American idea is that you create systems of freedom so that that experimentation can happen. What you're talking about.
But why? Why do you have to have coercion? Why is?
What if people don't want to give up their money? What if people don't want to abandon the marketplace? What if you don't?
But doesn't freedom have to be organized? Freedom is just another word in the series of words. So what is freedom? How is collective freedom exercised? You still have to give it an institutional form. So the question is, what is the institutional form of freedom? Freedom is not simply to say So one of the intellectual instruments of the market fundamentalists is this idea is that if you do nothing, what's left in place will somehow be the natural thing.
Yes.
But that's not true.
That's right.
What's left in place will be the creation of other political forces in the past, which you then falsely naturalize. You confer a retrospective halo of naturalization on the political constructions of the past.
Yes.
And you say, well, we don't want to experiment with that because that would be coercive. I don't think so. I think that these are different interpretations of collective choice and collective experimentation. And when the choice is made, or even the choice of the way of choosing, there is an element of coming to a decision. And once you come to a decision, the result is coercive. But what you can't accept is the idea that if you don't act collectively, what's there is the natural thing. Another form of this is revealed in the American constitutional state action doctrine. So the state action doctrine supposes that there are some situations in society in the creation of which the state is complicit. And there are others in which it's not complicit. Well, who made them? Someone made them, a previous state, another state. So the premise of the state action doctrine is that if you simply go away, if you don't act, there'll be something that will be natural. There won't be anything natural. Nothing is natural. Everything will be created by a will. Yeah. That's the basic debate. I think we're out of time.
Yeah, so last question.
The point of coercion, though, I feel like what we're talking about here is what Trump is doing. Done in a, it's so chaotic. Like, our institutions have not changed forever.
Right.
And arguably, it's because the leaders of both parties are practically, elitist status identical, and so care a lot about power and money.